On February 24, 1952, at 9:14 p.m., prisoner Stepan Kuznetsov did what all the laws of physics and instructions escort service of the main directorate of camps was considered a death sentence. He left the outer perimeter of Special Camp No. 7 in the midst of the black blizzard, when gusts of icy wind reached 38 mph. According to internal security regulations, persecution in such conditions was considered pointless. The human body at temperature of 42 degrees and such humidity loses the ability to thermoregulate in 12 minutes. After 20 minutes, crystallization of soft tissues occurs. Lieutenant Colonel Savelyev, who was on duty that night, did not even raise the alarm. He only ordered the introduction of a record of the liquidation of the object by the forces of nature. But Lieutenant Colonel Savelyev, being a career officer, did not understand one fundamental thing. In front of him was not just a ZK with the number 384 on a quilted jacket. In front of him was a leading design engineer of Deep A person who, before his arrest, calculated the coefficients of resistance of materials for objects capable of withstanding a direct hit by an aerial bomb. Stepan Kuznetsov did not run to nowhere. He left in advance calculated point of space, which he prepared for 2 years of the year, using each exit to the logging site for analysis geological section of the soil and wood density of old cedars. That night, Stepan violated not only the camp regulations, but also the very logic of survival. He was not carrying a ration of bread in his hands, but a homemade tool carved from a fragment spring steel and 800 GIC fat. In the documents of the MGB, he would later be called a ghost, but at that second, he was only a set of mathematical formulas moving through a wall of snow. He knew that at such atmospheric pressure, the sirens die down after 150 malars, and thermal imaging measurements of that time are not able to record a human warmth through a 30-centimeter layer of fresh snow. The first part of his path was pure ballistics. He moved under the angle 15 degrees to the direction of the wind to use the kinetic energy of the storm to accelerate the pace. Every breath he took was filtered through a woolen cloth. He knew that a direct inhalation of such icy air would result in an instant swelling lungs. After 4 hours of exhausting marching, when his consciousness began to narrow to the size of a matchbox, he saw him, a giant cedar, a tree patriarch, whose age has exceeded 400 years. For everyone else, it was a tree. For Kuznetsov, it was an ideal foundation, whose root system went 7 mm deep, creating natural voids in the permafrost. He did not climb inside the hollow. That would be too obvious. He began to infiltrate under the roots of the A zone, where the soil temperature, according to his calculations, was 9 degrees higher than on the surface. His crime against logic was that he decided to build a fortress where search dogs would only smell rotting organic matter and old needles. By 6 a.m., when the camp began to wake up, the guards lazily began to roll call. Stepan Kuznetsov was already underground, having sealed the entrance hatch from the inside with a layer of turf and clay, stirred with salt to prevent the locks from freezing. The camp command was already preparing an indictment to close the case. The military prosecutor signed the papers about death under unclear circumstances in the conditions of a harsh winter. But if they could look under the ground to a depth of 2.5 meters, they would not see a dying fugitive, but a person who methodically measured the pulse and wrote down the data in a notebook from Beresta. Stepan knew something that was not understood in Moscow offices. Safety is not the thickness of the walls, but the absence of signs of presence. Over the next 10 days, he turned his temporary burrow into a masterpiece of autonomous survival. His main problem was ventilation. A simple gift in the ground gave combat location by a column of steam, which in clear weather is visible from a kilometer away. Kuznetsov applied the principle of serpentine heat exchanger. He dug a narrow horizontal passage 12 mm long, which ended in dense thickets shrubs. The smoke from his tiny spirit lamp as it passed through this tunnel cooled completely, and the soot settled on the wet walls of the passage. At the exit, the air was absolutely clear and cold. His diet was calculated with accuracy to the calorie. 100 graws of pine nuts gave 650 calories. 5 gr of technical fat provided protection mucous membranes. He drank condensate, which he collected from copper plates fixed to the ceiling of his home. He took the plates out of the camp workshop one by one during the year, hiding them under the lining of a quilted jacket. Every millimeter of it was subject to the law of conservation of energy. However, in the third week, his perfect drawing collided with unforeseen factor. On March 7, 1952, at 1440, Stepan heard a sound that was not foreseen by his plan. It was not the wind and not the crunch of branches. It was vibration, heavy rhythmic blows on the surface of the earth directly above his head. The search party of the NKVD, reinforced by service dogs of the German Shepherd breed, went exactly to this square. Stepan froze, pressing his back against the cold root of the cedar. His knife, his only weapon, was on his knees. He could hear the snow creaking above him under the forged boots of the guards. The ventilation duct, his pride and salvation, suddenly became his main weakness. If the dog smells man through 12 memos of earth and soot, his engineering career will end in a firing squad. One of the guards, judging by the sound, it stopped right above the hatch. Stepan saw through a tiny crack how the snow was falling inside him shelters. At that moment, he realized that his life depended not on the strength of the ceilings, but on the chemical composition, a mixture that he sprayed around the tree, caustic makorka, turpentine, and pepper. The dog howled. It was not a bark of pursuit, but a cry of pain. The caustic mixture clogged her receptors. Stepan heard scolding the guard, who tried to make the dog work, but the animal spun in place, sneezing and losing orientation. The squad stood by the tree for 40 minutes. For 40 minutes, Kuznetsov did not breathe, counting the beats of his heart. He knew that if he made even one awkward movement now, the vibration would be transmitted through the ground and give away the emptiness under his feet. Soldier. When the sounds of footsteps finally subsided, Stepan realized that he had not just survived. He proved that engineering can be stronger than the state system of suppression. But this was only the beginning. By mid-April, flood. The permafrost, which served as a reliable foundation for him in winter, began to turn into a viscous porridge. Water has become fill the lower levels of his shelter. It was a technical crisis that could kill him faster than a guard's bullet. The pressure of the soil on the vault has tripled. The wooden spacers that he made from larch began to crackle. One night, Stepan woke up from the fact that a layer of earth collapsed 10 centimeters from his face. He had to make a decision that violated all safety standards. He began to dig a drainage well deeper, hoping to find a layer of sand that will absorb the water. He worked 18 hours a day, carrying out the earth in his pockets and distributing it along the bottom of its passage. His hands turned into a bloody callus. It was then that he first ran into the forest owner. One night, when he carefully opened the hatch to throw off the excess earth, he saw a pair of glowing eyes. The Shatun bear, awakened by the early warmth, stood 3 meters from his hiding place. The beast was emaciated and aggressive. He smelled the fat that came from Stepan. In any other situation, a person would be dead in a second. But Kuznetsov, who retained the cold mind of an engineer, did not flee. He remembered the physics of sound in the forest. He took out 2 metal plates and slammed them violently against each other right in front of the beast's face. Resonance was so powerful that the bear, whose ears are extremely sensitive to high-frequency sounds, recoiled and disappeared into the thicket. Stepan closed the hatch and sat in the dark for another hour, realizing that now his enemies were not only people, but nature itself, which he was trying to tame. By the summer of 1952, Stepan finally realized that his loneliness was his main armor. He began to keep a calendar, carving notches on the inner root of the cedar. Each notch is a day of victory over the system. He imagined how in the offices of the Ministry of State Security, his case was gathering dust in the archive marked "missing in action." But he also knew that Stalin, whom he called the main architect of fear, does not forgive defeats. Stepan was sure that they continue to search, if not physically, but in lists, in suspicions, in denunciations. One day, when he was collecting cedar resin, his only antiseptic, he came across traces that did not belong to neither the beast nor the guard. They were thin, almost imperceptible prints of shoes on soft moss. Someone passed by his hideouts are quite recent, and this someone was not a soldier, because soldiers walk in formation and noisy. It was hunter or geologist. Stepan's heart clenched. The presence of another person in his dead zone was a disaster. He began surveillance. For several days, like a shadow, he followed the stranger, remaining unnoticed. It was old man Mansi, a local hunter who seemed to know every stone in this forest. Stepan saw how the old man stopped at the same cedar and looked at its roots for a long time. The hunter muttered something in his own language and placed a piece of dried meat at the foot of the tree. It was a shock for Stepan. His hideout was discovered, but not by an enemy, but by someone who lived by the laws of the forest. Kuznetsov did not take the meat. He couldn't afford even a hint of contact. He just watched as the old man walked away, realizing that his secret no longer belonged to him alone. This case forced him to go even deeper into engineering research. He decided to create a system of false tracks and noise traps around the cedar. He spent dozens of hours creating stretch marks from the tendons of animals, which, in the event of a break, would lead to movement dry branches, creating a sound that imitates the movement of a large animal. His fortress became more and more complex. He began to perceive his home as a living organism, where he was the brain, and the roots of the tree were the nervous system. But his main problem was psychological hunger. For 6 months, he did not utter a single word. His voice, the ligaments began to atrophy. In order not to lose his mind, he began to lecture in the dark. He explained aloud the theory of the resistance of materials, read the poems of Bloch and Lermontov, recalled the drawings of the most complex objects. His voice sounded hoarse and unnatural, frightening to him. He understood that if he forgot human speech, he will cease to be an engineer and turn into a forest animal. In August of 1952, a fire broke out in the forest. It was the most terrible ordeal. The fire came like a crown fire, devouring everything in its path. The cedar, his home, and his only defense, could burst into flames at any second. Stepan understood that if the tree catches fire, it will suffocate in its hole from carbon monoxide in a matter of minutes. Smoke began to penetrate his ventilation ducts. The temperature inside rose to 40 degrees. Instead of fleeing and surrendering to the patrols, who must have combed the outskirts of the fire, Stepan began to fight. He used his reserves of water and clay to coat the inner walls of your shelter. He blocked the main ventilation passage and breathed through the layer-wet moss. It was a calculation for survival in conditions of oxygen shortage. He sat at the very bottom of his drainage well, pressed his face to the damp earth, and listened to the flames roaring above him. The heat was so intense that the roots of the tree began to groan from the thermal expansion. When the fire passed, Stepan got to the surface. The world around him turned into a black desert. His cedar was burned, but survived. Thick bark and powerful roots saved the tree, but now the camouflage was destroyed. On a black background of conflagration, any traces of human activity were visible in full view. He had to reinvent the stealth system. He began to use Zoll camouflage, covering the entrance to his hideout with it. He became part of this scorched forest, an invisible inhabitant. A few more months passed. The autumn of 1952 came. Stepan was 29 years old, but in the mirror made of a piece of metal, he saw an old man with gray locks and eyes full of ice tranquility. He waited for winter, knowing that the snow would hide him from the world again. But he did not know that in Moscow at that time, events were being prepared that would change the course of history. As he fought for every breath in his underground chamber, the chief, the architect of fear, was already signing his final orders. Stepan continued his war, not suspecting that his chief, the enemy, is also mortal. His engineering mind continued to work even in conditions of extreme exhaustion. He developed a lighting system using rotten wood that phosphorescent the wood he found in the swamps. These natural the lamps gave dim but sufficient light for him to continue his notes on birch bark. He wrote a treatise on underground construction in extreme conditions, hoping that someday this knowledge would be useful people. He believed that his experience was not just an escape, but a scientific experiment of exceptional importance. In October, I found that the camp guards had stepped up patrols. Apparently, one of the fugitives made a new attempt, or at the top, the leadership changed. He saw through the periscope a device made of two fragments of a mirror as groups of soldiers in the new Chanels. They were armed with PPSH submachine guns and led dogs on leashes. Kuznetsov hid. He switched to silence mode, stopped cooking hot food, and moved only at dusk. He became a real ghost, whose existence was confirmed only by rare, almost imperceptible changes in the landscape, which could only be noticed by the same master as himself. One night, he heard a human cry. It was so unexpected that I took it for the cry of a bird, but the sound was repeated. Someone was crying in the forest very close to his cedar. Stepan opened the door hatch. A man was sitting on a fallen tree 20 meters away. He was a young guy in a camp uniform, torn to shreds. A fugitive. He was wounded. His leg was bandaged with a dirty rag, through which blood showed through. Before Stepan became a dilemma. To help means to give yourself away and ruin 30 years of your project. How did he think then that this would be the project of a lifetime? To pass by means to leave a person to die. In it, the engineer fought and man. The engineer said, "Object number 1 must be isolated." The man shouted, "He's one of us." Stepan chose the third way. He did not come out to the guy, but at night, when he forgot himself heavy, he left a bundle of dried mushrooms and cedar resin ointment at his feet, and also pointed in the direction of an old hunting hut that he knew about. In the morning, the guy was gone. Stepan found a homemade sharpening at the place of his transmission. A nobleman of gratitude. This was his only contact with humanity for many months. This incident made him think about how many people like him are dying in these forests right now. He felt a strange pride in his fortress. He was the only one who was able to build a system capable of resisting the Gulag. His crime turned into the highest form of protest. He lived in defiance of the order of his death. He was alive proof that the human will, supported by knowledge of the laws of nature, is irresistible. The winter of 1952 promised to be even more severe. Stepan began to strengthen the vaults of his dwelling additional layers of ice and earth, creating the effect of an ice shell. He knew that this shell would even withstand the weight truck if it accidentally passes over it. He was preparing for a long siege, not knowing that it was the spring of '53 will bring news that he will wait for another 30 years. But for now, he just closed the hatch, plunging into the usual darkness, where his only interlocutors were the roots of the old cedar and his own thoughts on the greatness of the human mind. At the end of December, on New Year's Eve, something strange happened. Stepan heard the noise of engines. In the forest, where there was it sounded like a bolt from the blue. Through his periscope, he could see the heavy tracked tractors laying a few kilometers from his cedar. The construction of a new railway line began. His zone of silence was violated. This meant hundreds of workers, the constant presence of machinery, and the imminent risk of detection. Stepan realized that its first stage, the stage of implementation, is over. The second stage, the stage of coexistence, has begun. He had to learn to live in the shadow of a great construction site, remaining invisible to thousands of eyes. He began to study the schedule works, the sounds of equipment, the habits of builders. He became a noise expert. He could determine the brand of the tractor and the degree of its load by the sound of the engine. His life turned into the most difficult a chess game, where the price of a mistake was not just freedom, but the very existence of his unique world under the roots of the cedar. He began to make night forays to the construction site. Not for the sake of food, his reserves of nuts and mushrooms were enough, but for the sake of information. He stole scraps of newspaper, tools, even nails. Reading the newspapers in the light of phosphorizing rottenness, he tried to understand what was happening in the world. But the official press was full of reports on the achievements and glory of the leader. Stepan read between the lines. He saw how the rhetoric changed, how new names appeared. He felt that the tension in the system is growing. His engineering mind told them that such a gigantic structure as the USSR could not last forever exist in a constant voltage mode. He compared the state to a dam that is pressed too hard a large mass of water. Sooner or later, cracks will appear in the concrete. His task was to wait for this moment, remaining in the integrity within its resistance knot. He continued his calculations, his notes, and his lectures to the roots of the cedar, becoming the guardian of the truth that the world was not yet ready to hear. By March 1953, Stepan Kuznetsov had brought his system to a state that he himself called static equilibrium. In its underground shelter under the roots of a 400-year-old cedar, established a microclimate with a constant humidity of 68% and a temperature of +7°C. For a person living in permafrost conditions, this was comparable to the comfort of a Moscow apartment. But this comfort was not the result of luck, but of the most severe engineering calculation. Kuznetsov understood that his life depended on how effectively he could redistribute his body's energy and the scarce resources of the forest. On March 5, 1953, Stepan recorded unusual changes in the acoustic background of the forest. Through his homemade seismic sensor, a hollow deer bone dug into the bedrock, and leaning against his ear, he heard a distant rhythmic hum. These were not the engines of construction equipment. It was the ringing of bells and the hum of hundreds of voices coming from the direction of the camp and the nearest village. The vibration was so powerful that Stepan felt it with his fingertips. He didn't know that at that moment, millions of people wept when they learned of Stalin's death. For the engineer fugitive, this was an anomaly that he classified as abnormal mass anxiety of enemy personnel. He locked himself in his burrow for 18 days. He waited for the start of the roundup, assuming that the death of the leader would cause a wave of repression and cleansing in the forests adjacent to the camps. He switched to a zero-activity diet, 3 pine nuts per hour and 200 gras of melt water. It was during these days, being in absolute darkness and silence, he began to remember exactly how he had become a person capable of building a fortress made of mud and sticks. Stepan Pavlovich Kuznetsov was born in the 19th year in Sverdlovsk. His father, Pavel Kuznetsov, was master mason who participated in the construction of foundations for the giants of the first 5-year plan. His father taught him the main rule of the builder. The stone is never silent. He always warns when he wants to break. And at the age of 8, Stepan could already determine the brand of granite by the sound of a hammer blow. He knew that granite with pink shade is more fragile due to the impurities of feldspar, and the gray, fine-grained stone will withstand a pressure of 2,000 kilos per square stimeter. This tactile memory became the basis of his genius. In the 24th year, when he was 12 years old, as a teenager, he helped his father strengthen the vaults of the old Demidov mines. There he first understood how to work load distribution. He saw how the huge vaults were held together by one single point of support, the lockstone. If this stone is placed correctly, the structure will stand for centuries. If you make a mistake by half a centimeter, that's it will turn to dust. In 1931, Kuznetsov entered the Moscow Architectural Institute. Against the background of pretentious projects of Stalinist skyscrapers, Stepan chose the most unpopular and difficult specialization: underground fortification and protection of objects from the impact of the blast wave. While his fellow students were drawing columned porticos, Kuznetsov was studying physics propagation of the shock wave in various types of soil. He found out that clay dampens the energy of an explosion 3 times, more efficient than rock because of its ductility. His thesis was called Autonomous Systems Life Support in Conditions of Complete Isolation. In it, he calculated the parameters of an ideal bunker that could exist for decades without external nourishment. Professors called his project technical fiction, but at 30, in the 7th year, people in leather jackets came for him, not for arrest, but for work. Kuznetsov was sent to construction of secret facilities in the Far East and Siberia. He built command posts hidden under a layer of. He learned to disguise the outlets of the ventilation shafts as ordinary rock outcrops so that they could not be. From a distance of 10 steps, he knew how to create an acoustic trap system where any sound inside the bunker is muffled by special cavities in the walls. But it was this fanatical devotion to the cause that ruined him in 1948. He refused to sign the acceptance certificate object for the High Command, pointing out an error in the calculation of the strength of the ceilings. He said that when hit, an 800mm projectile will crack in 30 seconds. 2 days later, he was already in a cell in the Lubyanka. To him, 25 years in the camps, but when he was taken in Zaki's carriage to the north, Stepan did not feel fear. He felt professional interest. Gulag was a grandiose but poorly designed engineering system for him. I saw mistakes in the location of towers, in patrol schemes, in the very principle of holding people. He knew that the system has a fatigue point, and he decided to find that point. Returning to the reality of the 53rd year, Stepan realized that his seismic sensor no longer recorded the alarm. The world above seemed to stand still. He ventured to the surface on the night of April 16th. The forest was full of the smells of spring melting, but Kuznetsov felt something different. The smell of someone else's smoke, not camp smoke, but some other, more homely one. He walked the next 3 kilometers and saw something that was not expected. A small group of people who were neither convicts nor guards. It was a geological exploration party. He watched them for 3 days. He was struck by the way they communicated. In there was no fear. They laughed loudly, sang songs with a guitar, and did not look around. It was physically unbearable for a man who was accustomed to the sound of a camp convoy. Stepan felt that something had fundamentally changed in the structure of the country. The crack he had predicted went to the very top. It was during that period, in the mid-50s, that Stepan organized his underground laboratory. He needed something to occupy his mind, so as not to go crazy from the silence. He began to collect specimens of flora and fauna, but not as a naturalist, but as an engineer. He was interested in biomechanical properties materials. He studied the strength of the web of a local forest spider, finding that a filament 0.1 mm thick could withstand a weight of 800 grams before breaking. This gave him the idea of using a web and MXA tangle to filter water. He created a unique system of living light. In deep caves under the roots of the cedar, he bred colonies of glowing rotten mushrooms. He remarked that if you feed them with a certain type of tree sap, the intensity of the glow increases by 40%. This light was enough for him to read the 3 books that he had miraculously taken out of the camp. Handbook of the Civil Engineer of the 34th Year, a volume of Mayakovsky's poems, and a technical guide to repair of steam locomotives. These books became his library of meanings. He reread the handbook thousands of times, restoring it to drawings of all the bridges and buildings he had ever seen. Mayakovsky gave him the rhythm of life. His chopped. The lines helped to maintain clarity of thinking, and Stepan used the manual for steam locomotives for training logic, dissecting and assembling in his mind the mechanisms of Close and Stephenson. He turned his memory into a repository of data that no censorship could search. In 1958, Kuznetsov faced a threat that nearly destroyed his hideout. It was not but a pack of timber wolves. That winter, the frosts dropped to 55 degrees so. The animals went mad from hunger. They smelled human warmth seeping through the micro cracks in the ventilation shaft. Stepan heard their claws on the bark of the cedar right above his head. The wolves began to dig. Layer. The frozen ground was hard as concrete, but the teeth and claws of the predators were relentless. Stepan understood that in a couple of hours they would break through. There was nothing to shoot with, he only had a knife. But the engineer in it defeated the victim. He remembered the law of thermal expansion. He heated a piece of stone on his tiny alcohol lamp. 2. He wrapped it in wet moss and put it through a long pole into the ventilation hole. When the wolf grabbed this gift, there was an instant release of superheated steam. The physics worked flawlessly. Walk received a thermal burn of the mucous membrane and rushed away in terror. The rest of the pack, smelling the scorched wool and hearing the leaders shout, followed him. Kuznetsov again proved that knowledge of the laws of nature is the most powerful weapon. In the 60s, life in the forest became more difficult. The era of great Siberian construction projects began. Stepan heard how the earth is buzzing from explosions in distant quarries. He understood that civilization was advancing from all sides. At 60 in the 4th year, a search group of surveyors passed 10 meters from his door. He saw through the periscope their modern theodolites and levels. He recognized the brand of their devices. These were new models that he had only read about. Stepan felt a strange professional curiosity. He wanted to go out and correct them. He saw that they were setting the rail on the unstable soil, which will give an error of 30 centimeters per kilometer of track. It was excruciating to see the technical illiteracy and have no right to correct it. He bit his lip until it bled, clutching his knife in his hands, and continued to watch. It was his personal tribunal. He judged himself for the fact that his knowledge died with him in this pit. It was during this period that he began to build an acoustic map of the forest. He noticed that the sound from a passing train can be heard for 18 kilometers if you press your ear to a certain limestone layer. He calculated the speed of sound propagation in different layers of soil. In dry sand, 300 menske, in dense clay, 800, in granite, $3,000. Using this data, he could predict the appearance of any person within a radius of 3 kilometers with an accuracy of 5 minutes. The 60s became the height of ascetic perfection. He learned to synthesize vitamin C and cedar needles, preventing scurvy. He developed a system of underground farming, growing edible roots in areas where cedar roots excreted more total moisture. His body became dry and stiff like steel wire. At the age of 52, he could pull himself up to one hand 24 times, the result of daily training in the confined space of his mind. But the biggest battle was yet to come. In 1972, during a great drought, a peat fire broke out in the forest. It was scarier of the crown flame. Peat burns underground at a temperature of 600 degrees without smoke and flame. He eats away the voids, turning the ground into a trap. Kuznetsov understood this from the behavior of insects. Ants began to leave their nests en masse, moving inside of the stream. Stepan realized that his shelter was right in the path of the underground fire. If peat is under the roots, the cedar will catch fire. He will burn alive in his fortress. He had 8 hours. He used the tactics of hydraulic hammer. Using his drainage well and a system of natural voids, he began to manually pump water from a forest stream, deep layers of soil. He turned the area around the tree into a swamp, creating a water barrier 5 mm wide. The work was on the verge of human capabilities. His heart was beating with a purity of 140 beats per minute. He dragged it by the night, about 3 tons of water, using only leather buckets of their own making. When the underground fire approached its line, a terrible whistle of steam was heard. The ground around the cedar began to smoke. But the water barrier withstood. Stepan lay at the bottom of his hole, exhausted, listening, like the water boiling under him. He again outplayed the elements, using only knowledge of thermodynamics and soil mechanics. In the mid-70s, a realization came to him that was the beginning of his end as a forest ghost. He understood that his calculations about the inviolability of the system were wrong. Through the stolen scraps of newspapers that he found on the ground tourist camps, he read about space flights, about the relaxation of international tensions, about new names in the government. He saw pictures of people who didn't look like guards. His paranoia began to give cracks. He began to doubt whether Stalin was looking for him and whether Stalin was alive. There was already more than 8,000 notches in his calendar. 22 years of complete isolation. He began to catch himself talking to the cedar, not about Sapromat, but about his feelings. He told the tree about the girl Masha, whom he loved in 1938, about the smell of freshly cut grass in the Sverdlovsk, about the taste of hot bread. His engineering brain began to rebel against isolation. The escape project turned into a senseless imprisonment, but the fear of the tribunal was still stronger than the thirst for freedom. He remembered Article 58. He remembered the faces of the guards. He didn't know that the world had changed so much that his crime had long been history. In the 79th year, Stepan Kuznetsov made his most daring sortie. He reached the edge of the forest, from where the view of the modern highway. He saw huge trucks rushing along the asphalt at a speed of 80 km/h, bright neon signs at a gas station. It looked like an alien civilization. Stepan stood in the shade trees, dressed in skins, overgrown with a gray beard, and looked at this world with horror and delight. He realized that his survival technology is the Stone Age compared to what humans have created over the years. But he also realized that of these people in bright jackets, he would not have survived a night in his conditions. This gave him one last flash of pride. He's an engineer who built the impossible. But loneliness was milking him from within. He began to notice that his hands were trembling when he tries to sharpen the knife. His eyesight was declining. He understood that if he died here, in this hole, then no one will never know of his triumph. His blueprints on the birch bark will rot, his life support system will collapse, and the cedar will simply consume his body. This thought of zero result was unbearable for the designer. He began to prepare his final report. He systematized all his notes on birch bark, packed them in airtight containers made of resin and wax. He wrote his story using technical language, dry and precise. He wasn't begging for mercy, he was just documenting fact. I, Stepan Kuznetsov, conducted an experiment on survival in an absolutely hostile environment for 30 years. Results confirm that the human mind is the dominant factor in any architectural system. In the beginning, in the 80s, Stepan turned 70 years old. His body became fragile, but his mind remained sharp as his knife of spring steel. He knew that his time in the forest was running out. He saw the old cedar begin to wither. There was no tree either eternal. The inner voids that Stepan used for his home began to expand. Design became unstable. Engineer Kuznetsov understood that the object was subject to dismantling or commissioning. He couldn't let his project end uncontrolled collapse. He began to plan his last outing, an exit that had to be either his triumph or his execution. He did not yet know that in 1982, the world had already forgotten about Stalin as a living god, and that the question of whether the owner is alive will become a voice from a deep grave for contemporaries. But before we get to the final moment, when the old man in skins puts his homemade knife on the table of the policeman on duty, we need to understand how Stepan spent his last winters, what thoughts came to him in moments of complete despair, and what exactly made him to take that very last step out of the forest. About his struggle with his own memory, about the latest technical decisions of a dying genius, and about the great shock that awaited him on the threshold of civilization in the final part of our story. Stepan Kuznetsov sat in his hole, his back pressed against the dry root of a cedar, and listened to the silence. It was silence of the finished drawing. The last line was drawn. There was only the emptiness of a white sheet ahead. Keter, 1981. For Stepan Kuznetsov, he recorded in his journal from Berest as a period of critical wear and tear of supporting structures. This was not only about his underground fortress, but also about his own body. At the age of 69, a design engineer realized that the reliability coefficient of his biological system had fallen below a critical point. Joints that, for 3 decades, they had been operating in conditions of constant humidity and limited amplitude, now they responded to each movement with a sound reminiscent of the grinding of dry metal. But the main problem was his giant, a 400-year-old cedar. The contractor tree served Stepan as a foundation, a roof, and the only friend began to die. The fire of the 70s years and the subsequent change in the level of groundwater led to the fact that the core of the cedar turned into dust. Stepan felt it through his acoustic sensors. The resonance of the barrel changed. Instead of a pure, deep hum in gusts of wind, the tree made a rattling false sound. As a specialist in the strength of materials, Kuznetsov understood that in the next powerful snowstorm, the tree would simply fold, crushing it along with the entire laboratory and archives. He spent the entire 81st year in a continuous engineering struggle for the life of the Keter. He created a system of external and internal ties. Using the skills he had learned in the 30s in the construction of mines, he developed a method reinforcement of living wood. He drove into the hollows of the trunk to the line of larch, previously soaked in resin, creating an artificial skeleton inside the tree. It was the most complex surgical operation on the body of nature, made with homemade tools in complete darkness. For the installation of the central strut alone, it took 3 months for 7 hours of work a day in a bent state, when the pressure of the soil on the spine was, according to him, calculations, about 40 kilograms per square meter. During this period, his mind began to give out strange glitches. Stepan became notice that his thought processes slowed down. Logarithmic calculations that he used to do in his head for seconds now required minutes. To counter the entropy of the brain, he complicated his daily lectures. For now, he didn't just read poetry or explain the theory of concrete. He began to design in his mind a city of absolute autonomy. He calculated sewerage systems, heating networks, and transport interchanges for a metropolis that could to exist completely underground, protected from any outside influence. He worked out every valve, every safety valve in detail, forgetting that his real world was limited 5 square meters. By November 81, Stepan was facing a calorie deficit. Forest emptied. Rodents, which used to be its stable source of protein, have left the scorched zone. Pine nut stalks were exhausted because the dying tree ceased to bear fruit. His diet was reduced to 300 GMO dried mushrooms and 100th pine needles in soups. Kuznetsov's weight fell to 48 kilos, resembled a man, a leather-covered skull, deeply sunken eyes, and a long white as a loon beard. But in those eyes, the cold fire of a calculating mind was still burning. In December, there was an incident that Stepan classified as an invasion of technology. At night, he heard a sound that was not present in his library of noises. It was not a tractor and not an airplane. It was a quiet, high-pitched whistle that was rapidly approaching. Stepan fell to the periscope. At 300 mx from his shelter, along the snow-covered gap, a strange ski apparatus with a caterpillar behind was rushing. It was a modern snowmobile. Sitting on it were 2 men in brightly colored synthetic jackets that glowed in the light of their own headlights. Stepan froze. It was the first time he had seen materials of such colors. The red and blue colors of the jackets were so saturated that seemed physically painful to him. He looked at them as if they were creatures from another planet. One of the men jumped down into the snow and took a small box out of his pocket. A voice was heard, loud, clear, devoid of interference. It was a portable walkie-talkie for Kuznetsov, whose world froze in era of tube radios the size of a bedside table. It was a technological shock. He understood. The world is beyond him. The forest has not just changed. He made a quantum leap. This meeting was a catalyst. Stepan realized that his isolation no longer makes sense. His knowledge of fortification in the fortifications of the fortifications, his unique experience of survival, all this could be unnecessary junk in a world where people carry wireless walkie-talkies in their pockets. He felt himself an architect who built perfect pyramids all his life, while humanity learned to fly to the stars. But there was one question that still kept him down. Who is in the Kremlin now? All winter of '82, Stepan was preparing his exit from the project. He understood that just getting out meant giving up. As an engineer, he had to ensure the transfer of documentation. He packed his birch bark diaries into 3 airtight containers made of boiled birch bark and filled with a layer of coniferous varnish. These were 30 years of his life, recorded with an accuracy of a millimeter and a second. He prepared his clothes, a strange hybrid of a camp cotton jacket, which he had repaired 3,000 times, and wild animal skins. The decisive moment came on May 23, 1982. On this day, his cedar let out its last moan. The internal strut, which Stepan installed with such difficulty, could not withstand the pressure. The barrel cracked along the entire length. It was a sign. The object is subject to immediate evacuation. Stepan Kuznetsov checked the cleanliness of his hole for the last time, carefully folded the tools, and took his homemade knife. He didn't feel fear. He felt the fatigue of a structure that had finally been given permission to destroy. It took him a long time to get to the surface, almost 2 hours. His muscles were unaccustomed to vertical loads. When he pushed the hatch aside and climbed out from under the roots, the light of the spring sun blinding him. He was on his knees, shutting his eyes, and I felt the warm wind touch his face. This was the first time in 30 years that he had inhaled air that had not been passed through 12 men's of ventilation ducts. He smelled life, sharp, multifaceted, stunning. The way to the nearest village took 3 days. Stepan walked, guided by the old petitions, which now turned into wide roads. He was amazed by the amount of metal in the forest, abandoned cables, wreckage of cabs, empty fuel barrels. The world became dirty and noisy, but in this noise you could feel incredible power. On the second day, the clap came out. Huge openwork towers of steel stretching over the horizon made him stop. He approached one of these and touched the metal. 500 kV hummed above his head. For the engineer, it was music. He realized that the country he feared had built something grandiose. On May 24th, Stepan Kuznetsov came to the outskirts of the village, which was called Severny. He looked like a nightmare from the past, revived, overgrown in strange rags, with a mad but piercingly clear gaze. Children playing on the outskirts, they fled with shouts. He was not offended. He understood that his appearance did not correspond to the accepted aesthetic norms of that time. He purposefully walked to the building over which the red flag was flying. It was the local police department. This is where the final part of our story begins. The last 5,000 characters that will draw a line under 30 years of silence. Stepan entered the police building slowly, trying not to make sudden movements. There was a smell in the duty unit, bleach and tobacco. Smells he hadn't felt in decades. Behind the glass sat a young sergeant who was lazily writing something in a magazine. Seeing Stepan, the sergeant froze, and his hand slowly reached for the holster. In front of him stood a creature from another reality, a man whose skin was the color of tree bark and whose clothes seemed to be part of the forest landscape. Kuznetsov stopped 3 meters from the counter. His hands were raised, his palms were open, an old camp gesture. He tried to speak, but only a dry, whistling sound escaped from my throat. He cleared his throat and finally, in a quiet but incredibly clear voice, said, "I am prisoner number 384 Kuznetsov Stepan Pavlovich. He escaped from Special Camp number 7 in February of 1952. I came to declare his location and surrender his personal weapons." He slowly laid out his homemade knife forged from a spring on the barrier. The sergeant looked at the knife, then at Stepan, then at the knife again. There was no hatred or suspicion in his eyes. They had a complete, absolute bewilderment. For a guy born in the early 60s, Special Camp number 7 sounded as abstract as the Spartacus uprising. "Father, where did you come from?" The sergeant finally exhaled. "What camp? What 52nd years? Have you just come out of the woods?" Stepan did not answer. He was waiting for a different reaction. He waited, shouting on his knees, hands behind his head, waiting for the clang of handcuffs and the call of a special convoy of the Ministry of State Security. He was waiting for the start of the very procedure which he had been preparing for 30 years. An hour later, all the management gathered in the department. The head of the department, a major with tired eyes, and an elderly district police officer who remembered the times of Khrushchev arrived. They were sitting in the study, and Stepan was sitting opposite them, straight as a taut string. In front of him stood a glass of hot tea, real tea, the smell of which made his hands tremble slightly. Stepan Pavlovich began, the major, leafing through an old yellowed folder that had been brought from the archives. "We found It's Up to You." It was indeed written off to the archives in March of 1952, with the note "Death," as a result of escape in conditions extremely low temperatures. "You understand that you have been dead for the state for 30 years. "I was doing a survival project," Kuznetsov replied dryly. "My calculation turned out to be correct. I'm alive. Now I am ready to bear responsibility for the violation of the charter. Take me to my master." Silence reigned in the office. The elderly district police officer sighed heavily and looked at the window. "What master, Stepan Pavlovich?" he asked quietly. "Tvarishch Stalin," said Kuznetsov firmly. "I know he doesn't. He likes it when his calculations are disputed. I am ready to prove my case to him. Is he very angry with me?" Leaned back in his chair. He looked at Stepan with a strange feeling. It was the media with pity and the deepest respect. He realized that he was facing a man who had spent 30 years in the self-imposed hell, fighting a ghost that is long gone. Stepan Pavlovich, the major, paused, choosing the words. "Stalin died in March of 1953, a year after your escape. He is no more. It's been 29 years since he was gone, and there are no camps, and there is almost no article of yours. He was rehabilitated in 1956, posthumously." Kuznetsov did not move. His face remained motionless, like a mask made of petrified wood. Only the fingers clutching the glass of tea turned white. "Dead," he whispered. So the roar in 53, vibration of the soil, bell ringing. It was him. It was him. The district police officer confirmed. Stepan slowly lowered head. His whole world, all his fortress under the cedar, all his engineering calculations, all his sacrifices and deprivations, all this in one, the moment, turned to zero. He has been building a defense against emptiness for 30 years. He fought with a dead man for 30 years. His brilliant The Survival Project turned out to be the largest and most senseless construction in the history of mankind. He did not cry. Engineers of his hardening do not cry over destroyed structures. They analyze the causes of the collapse. He realized that his main mistake was not the calculation of the strength of the beams, but the calculation of durability of time. He overestimated the stability of the system and underestimated the speed of human life. He was standing on the threshold of a new world, a world with space stations and walkie-talkies in his pockets, and felt like a detail that did not fit any mechanism. He was not arrested. On the contrary, doctors were summoned. He was given clean clothes and settled in a local hospitals. The news of the forest engineer spread instantly. Journalists began to come to him, but he refused to speak. He only once asked to bring him modern textbooks on construction and physics. 3 days he read them, almost without looking up. And on the 4th day he closed the last book and said to the doctor, "That's right. The materials have improved, but the principles have remained the same. It was not in vain that I taught the roots of Kedrosapromat." Stepan Kuznetsov lived in a new world for him for only a few months. His body, accustomed to sterile cleanliness, forest air, and strict discipline of survival, could not withstand the encounter with city dust and an excess of information. He died quietly in his sleep in August 1982. Before his death, he asked to hand over his birchbark diaries to the Moscow Civil Engineering Institute. He wanted his project to be adopted by the commission. He was buried on the local cemetery. At the request of a police major, an inscription was carved on a simple monument. Engineer Kuznetsov, SP. Project completed. And in the forest, 12 square meters from the village, there is still an old burnt cedar. His barrel is now finally split, and under the roots, an ideal underground fortress is slowly crumbling to dust. Clay absorbs birch bark walls. Moss grows through ventilation ducts. Nature takes its own, erasing the traces of the longest, the loneliest feat of engineering in history. But if you press your ear to the ground in calm weather, it seems that you can hear a distant, barely perceptible hum. It resonates with the old cedar, preserving the memory of the man who proved that even in the deepest underground, the mind can remain free if it obeys only the laws of physics and conscience. Stepan Kuznetsov left without knowing that his diaries had finally reached Moscow, and that the modern engineers who studied him, records on Berest, were amazed by the accuracy of his calculations and the boldness of technical solutions. His senseless, the project has become a textbook for those who build deep facilities today. It turned out that 30 years in the hollow cedars were not just an escape. It was the highest school of the human spirit, where eternity itself was the main examiner.